Rottenomics is my attempt to present the story of New Zealand's leaky buildings disaster. This a full account of the origins and extent of this disaster had never been done before that I know of. So that's my attempt to, and that's what I wanted to do. And I wanted to present it in a readable fashion, but at the same time, a reasonably thorough fashion based on evidence and data. So that's the idea. So here we go. Really the most eye-catching or / shocking aspect of the whole thing is are the estimates of the cost of leaky dwellings. They range from $47 billion to $52 billion. The $47 billion, they're both conservative estimates. The $47 billion estimate is based on data from a 2009 PricewaterhouseCoopers report, Weather Tightness, estimating the cost. And it's based on data from there, combined with data from another report, data on residential weather tightness failures, written in 2015. I was going to say published, but it was never published. It was prepared for MBIE by Dr. Andrea Knox of Counterbalance Research and Evaluation and Lisa Starr of Proof Research. I found out about this report essentially by accident. So when I did find out about it, I asked MBIE to let me have a look. MBIE denied that there was such a report. Fast forward at least 12 months, the ombudsman found what I was looking for and ordered MBIE to send it to me. So this, beyond what I've published on my website, this report still hasn't been published, but there's a lot of valuable data in there, in my opinion. So this is based on the estimates. The $47 billion estimate combines data from from the PwC report and from data on residential weather tightness failures. So PwC had a conservative estimate of cost to dwelling ratios at $245,000. I have to remember this is 2009 dollars, and Knox Starr estimated 174,395 leaky dwellings built between 1985 and 2014. You combine the two and you get $47 billion as a total estimate of the repair costs of leaky dwellings. Now it's important to emphasize that this is only an estimate for dwellings. There haven't been any government demands for an estimate of the total problem, as far as I know. No demands for the sum total costs of leaky schools, leaky hospitals, leaky government buildings, nothing in there. It's only dwellings. So obviously the $47 billion is only a partial estimate. It just gives an idea again of how large the figure is. The $52 billion estimate comes from combining data from those two reports again, using the PricewaterhouseCoopers estimate of the average cost of a full reclad. As most of the people in this audience know, there are a number of ways to go about addressing weather tightness failure. The most commonly used one has been the full reclad / reroof estimate, the kind that gives everyone a good feeling that all the problems have been addressed. And this is a conservative figure because these, as again, the 2009 figures are not adjusted for inflation. So if all the dwellings were subjected to the full clad / full reroof, it would cost about $52 billion. We'll have more on that later. The figure 174,395 dwellings comes from data on residential weather tightness failures. This was submitted the 15th February 2015. I learned about it in January 2016. I asked to see it. MBI denied it existed, as I already said. MBIE sent me the report almost a year and a half later, in June 2017. Weather tightness failure clearly remains hidden to a large extent. A major reason for that appears to be government obfuscation and obstruction. This is a story, as everyone knows, of systemic failure, not only in buildings, but in the building industry and government, I would say. For more than a quarter century, our building industry, our economy, and our government have failed to provide this most basic guarantee: new buildings will not rot. This is a photo here is of mold attacking the framework, the framing of a building. It's almost unrecognizable. It's so bad. Photo courtesy of Phil O'Sullivan, who was a big help in this effort. I use the model of the perfect storm to attempt to describe this disaster. Talking about leaky buildings with people in the industry, it's not unusual to hear this phrase. Leaky buildings are the result of an unfortunate confluence of a broad variety of factors: industrial, legislative, historical, and cultural. The majority of these elements developed relatively recently, during the 2 decades from 1979 to 1998. The basic structure of Rottenomics is to lay out a chapter, each one more or less parallel to one of the elements of the leaky building's perfect storm. It doesn't follow that template perfectly, but that's the basic organizing element. Okay, so the earliest publicity about this disaster I was able to find came from the New Zealand Herald in late October 1994. Unusual numbers of recently built houses were rotting. This is from the New Zealand Herald. The newspaper reported a good number of these new homes had features in common, most notably the exterior finish. Monolithic stucco exterior cladding, evoking the Mediterranean look, was in vogue. The ongoing building boom nurtured a toxic combination: poorly skilled, poorly supervised, recent industry entrants under tremendous time pressure to build in new, unfamiliar designs, and often with new, unfamiliar, untested, and unregulated materials. Greg O'Sullivan, in this article, a brand's accredited advisor, said many of these houses were, quote, potential time bombs. John Green, president of the Auckland Master Builders Association, saw the problem in an even bleaker light. In his view, the complaints that were coming in were the tip of the iceberg. Both men proved to be spot on, probably more than they had imagined. The first chapter in my book is about a woman who I've named Sarah. That's not her real name. And this story starts off with the sentence: "It took 3 years for Sarah's beautiful new home to make her sick." Referring to the mold, she said, "It's almost like a steroid. It kind of keeps you awake." And this is the important part to me. The most important part is the human part. What this story, this disaster, the effect it has had on people. She continued, "Even though you're terribly fatigued, you've kind of got this adrenaline running. Then came stomach and bowel disturbances, irregularity. But the worst thing was the cough, consistent and embarrassing." She said, "I couldn't say half a sentence without having to cough. Sore lungs, sore chest, and sleeplessness eventually induced despondency." She said, "It's your home, your life savings, and your health. You lose friendships because you're not a happy person to be around." Sarah was sick for 3 years. This is a picture of one of Sarah's soffits from her brand new apartment complex. Now, when the leaky buildings problem finally exploded into the press, of course, the reaction to it in the Beehive was a blame fest. The two parties had a contest to see which one could shift the blame onto the other. So in one of my chapters starts "The National Party Smelt Blood." In Parliament on 19 November 2002, leader of the opposition Bill English held forth, quote, "What a mess. What a trail of incompetence and deceit over the most serious issue that hundreds of thousands of New Zealand homeowners face." Unsurprisingly, Labour had a different perspective, though the blame game was the same. Leader of the House, Labour's Michael Cullen stated, "The wonderful thing was that the National Party somehow seemed to want to try to claim that the entire problem suddenly emerged in December 1999 and had never occurred before, even though it was that party's Building Act, its Building Industry Authority, and it was its ex-president, Sir George Chapman, who chaired the Building Industry Authority for a great deal of his life." One of the running themes in my book is that it's just so seems to have turned out that between National Labour, the blame for this, any blame shared by the government seems to have been shared pretty equally. I'd say 50-50 really by both sides. Ignored by both sides. When the Building Act was passed under the fourth national government in December 1991, it was so popular in the House, nobody bothered to count and record the votes. A voice vote was all that was needed. It appears the Building Act 1991 enjoyed unanimous support in Parliament. The first issue that came up the most was untreated timber. That was the one that got the most headlines. So here's a little bit about that, the history of it. In 1950, timber treatment, the boron treated timber became officially recognized in 1952. Going back to 1900, an article in the New Zealand Official Yearbook 1900 lamented the wholesale denudation of our native forests. It is only a question of time and supplies will have to be drawn from artificial forests or from foreign sources. So deforestation had a lot to do with how we came to rely on radiata as our principal building timber. In 1913, a submission to the Royal Commission of Forestry read, "Pinus insignius, radiata, is absolutely worthless unless treated in some form, except for timber where no weather reaches it." 1946, the Director of Forestry, Alexander Pat Entrecan, wrote, "It would be nothing less than a tragedy if in a few years' time, due to negligence now, a significant number of structures were to suffer a high rate of deterioration." That message seems to have been lost on the building industry. 4 years later, in March 1950, Entrecan was compelled to announce the Forest Service was now advocating, quote, "compulsory and appropriate treatments of radiata." The question then became exactly how to do this. The picture is the report of the Committee of Inquiry into the Treatment of Timber by the borax acid process. This is the decision that, well, I'll read it. The committee decided in this way. The committee believes that the diffusion impregnation process properly applied could result in an adequate impregnation and distribution of boric acid throughout the cross-section of building timbers. The committee followed with an emphatic recommendation, the establishment of a Timber Preservation Authority, TPA. Crucially, the TPA would have enough power to control timber preservation generally and to police timber preservation. Guy Cavanaugh, formerly of Carter Holt Harvey, said, "The TPA actually had teeth. It employed inspectors, and inspectors could descend on a treatment plant and do an audit without warning." So the story of untreated timber comes after this. So in September 1995, the NZS 3602 committee approved limited use of structural untreated kiln-dried UTKD radiata in New Zealand buildings. This decision has been blamed, probably more than any single element, for leaky buildings. Key to understanding the thinking at the time is that timber treatment addresses two hazards, as most of this audience probably knows: insect attack and decay. Decay is, of course, the focus in any discussion of the causes of leaky buildings. Where building materials do not decay, there are no leaky buildings. In the hundreds of pages of NZS 3602 1995 files, there is very little mention of or concern with decay. On the odd occasion when decay was mentioned, it was typically brushed aside because, after all, in the words of a 1992 Brands report, it could only occur in buildings that were, quote, poorly designed, constructed, or maintained. Such buildings were highly unusual or had been. Rather, the focus in the committee was always the risk of insect attack, that is, borer. Carter Holt Harvey, a giant whose assets totaled $7.5 billion that fiscal year, employed 2 of the 10 members of the committee, and 1 more who sat in on 2 of the 3 meetings. This is an ad for chemical-free laser frame, the Carter Holt Harvey product. And here's an ad for Harditex, monolithic cladding. You'll notice that even the model seems to be wearing monolithic cladding. So this was from July 1995. And the quote from the ad is, "The ideal lightweight cladding for a monolithic finish. The only limiting factor is your imagination. Stucco is one of 3 types of barrier claddings. The others are fiber cement board and polystyrene external insulation finishing systems, EIFS, aka chili bin claddings. These materials are storage claddings. They soak up water quickly and easily. When they fail, moisture is trapped and stored inside the cladding and in the timber behind it. As prominent building surveyor Philip O'Sullivan put it, if you want to grow fungus, just stick it in a plastic bag." Another line from O'Sullivan comes to mind. One building physicist declared, "Building science isn't rocket science, it's harder." He should know, he used to be a rocket scientist. And from another, "You know, we were playing with the atom, making nuclear bombs, so surely we can make a wall that doesn't leak. Well, we were wrong." John Sutherland summed it up. "What none of the approvals and appraisals have taken into account is that it seems too difficult, in too many instances, to construct the face seal sheet cladding systems so that they are weather tight." Now we get into building controls and the role that they may have played in this situation. There was large discontent in the building industry, and it led to research, reports, and a solution in Building Act 1991. Initially, there were 2 perspectives. One perspective was research-based. Professor Helen Tippett, Dean of the New Zealand School of Architecture, published Building Controls in New Zealand in July 1982, revised in October. Professor Tippett mentioned performance-based controls only once. She did not endorse them at the time. Rather, she wrote, "The reform actions likely to succeed are those which recognize complex systems have to be designed to resolve complex system problems. The focus was on costs and, at first, benefits. Fix the good bits, keep the rest." The other approach was the informal approach. This was the approach of the Building Regulations Industry Group, BRIG. They believed that this approach would lead to more open and frank expression of views. The focus was exclusively on costs of the current system, not on benefits. Increasing interest in all new performance-based building control system, Out with the old, in with the new. This resulted in the 1983-84 two-volume review of planning and building controls. How did Brigg, Searle, and Scular, Searle and Scular were the authors of the review of planning and building controls. How did Brigg, Searle, and Scular and the Building Industry Commission become keen enough on performance-based building control to want to switch over completely? It was the Building Industry Commission report that led to the Building Act 1991. What did these people know about how such a system, the performance-based system, actually worked, or how to administer it effectively? Where were the studies, the data, the real-life experience? Where was the evidence of how a performance-based building control system worked? The simple answer, there was none. Even so, this stream prevailed. And it resulted in Building Act 1991. Essentially, here are the problems with the solution. The act was essentially an experiment, a radically new and different building control system. The Building Industry Commission wrote, "The size of the educational task in itself cannot be underestimated and can be compared with the introduction of metrication in the mid-60s. Successful implementation will follow from acceptance, which can only be achieved through understanding. Unlike, however, metrication, there were no funds for education. This was down by default to local government. Bizarrely, all BIA spending, Building Industry Authority spending, had to be approved by both Internal Affairs and Treasury. Unlike metrication, 7 years, New Zealanders were given less than 7 months to learn to work with the new building controls. The BIA, Building Industry, in quotes, Authority, was chronically, hopelessly underfunded. Coupled with equally meager real authority, this meant the BIA was set up to fail. This is what happened. Later, Dr. Bill Porteous, the BIA CE, said that every year he wrote to Internal Affairs arguing that the territorial authorities had been promised money for proper education programs, as with metrication, but this never happened. And he said, "I think it was the dead hand of Treasury just saying, no, 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 things are running along quite nicely. Now it's just spending money for spending money's sake." The quote, authority had no authority whatever to keep untested building products off the market. The picture is of Treasury and the beehive. And this indicates to me, it symbolizes the influence that Treasury had over the research that ended up in the Building Act. At the Coalface is one of my chapters, and it deals with what happens when the Building Act actually is enforced and what happens to the industry and the people who are in charge of enforcement. In other words, building control officers. I talked with one of the building control officers who worked during this time at Palmerston North City Council. She was an example of underfunded, overworked building control officers during this period. She worked for 10 years, 1992 to 2001. So here are some of the reasons for that mix-up. There were no funds for local authority education regarding Performance-Based Building Act and the completely new set of building controls. Basically, they just said, over to you. It's up to you to learn this and to put it into effect. The workload is essentially doubled, she told me. They had something new called the Project Information Memorandum. And this was supposed to come in separately. And then the building consent was filled out and came in. Unfortunately, especially during boom times, these two came in together and it doubled the paperwork for building control officers. However, even with the doubling of work and the building booms, there were no funds whatever provided for extra personnel. She told me, quote, the piles just never went down. They just kept going. Yeah, we had a few times when we had people in tears because the workload was just so high. It was massive, massive. And there was a lot of pressure on all of the staff, everybody. Thank you. So the building boom, 1993, 1998, exaggerated all of this. So there was pressure to cut corners. Thank you, Holly. Oh, that's much better. During the worst of all of this, Tony worked 7 days a week for 9 months. Quote, she simply didn't want to fail. One of the worst stories of this, most egregious examples of all of this, in my opinion, was at least the ones that I heard, was the story of Milton and Jean Pedley. The story is laid out in the book, and I'll just lay out a little bit of it here. They were interested in a house. They were interested in a house in Fielding. It looked nice, but they wanted to make sure that it had a building consent so that it was signed off. So he went to the city council and looked for a sign off, and there was no sign off. So he decided it wasn't worth looking at. They didn't want to buy it. A few weeks later, his real estate agent approached him and said, "Why weren't you interested?" And he said, "Well, it was never signed off." And then mysteriously, as he put it, so a short time later, he found out through his real estate agent that it had been signed off. So he thought, well, we've got no more problems. The council approved it. Well, within a very short time after they moved in, they started noticing a funny smell. And long story short, their house was riddled with rot. And when he notified the Fielding City Council about this, they gave him a notice to fix. This was delivered on the 2nd of November 2011. Then he was supposed to fix it himself in less than 4 weeks. And this notice came with a threat. Quote, if you do not comply, you may be liable for a fine of up to $200,000 and a further fine of up to $20,000 for each day or part of a day that you fail to comply with this notice. I said it was the Fielding District Council. It was the Manawatu District Council. So his story, eventually, after years and years of torture and tears, as he put it, he finally ended up fixing himself, spending hundreds of thousands of dollars. Now, here's one of the aspects of the perfect storm: was lost training and lost skills. During the Rottenomics revolution, we lost a lot. And a lot of that was government institutions that were dumped in favor of the free market. The market was going to perform these functions much more efficiently and much more cheaply. That was kind of the mantra of the revolution of the times. So up until between 1897 and 1987, we had something called tripartism in labor, government, industry relations. We had 3 equal partners: government, unions, and industry. So the government actually provided rigorous industry skills trainings through several of their important skills training institutions at railways, Ministry of Works, Post Office, and Ministry of Education. And the unions, of course, provided skills training through union apprenticeships. So after 90 years of state-sponsored skills training, the State-Owned Enterprises Act carved out 9 state-owned corporations out of a group of government ministries and departments. These new businesses were to be as, quote, profitable and efficient as incomparable businesses that are not owned by the Crown. Finishing things off in terms of government skills training and skills training in general, actually, was the Employment Contracts Act 1991. At the heart of this act was this fiction. In the absence of union representation, laborers and employers would bring equal powers to contract negotiations. From the other camp, apprenticeships are history since the Employment Contracts Act. Now, don't get me wrong. I think the Employment Contracts Act is the best thing that's ever happened in this country, but it's really dealt to apprentices. So training was dealt 2 body blows in this time, government training and private industry training. And this contributed obviously to a huge loss of industry skills, which we've still been unable to make up. One of the most interesting aspects of the Building Act 1991 was a completely new institution, private building certifiers. This was a hybrid where it grafted in, government institutions and inspections onto private industry. And so it was actually, and from hindsight, it's very easy to see that it was a manifest conflict of interest. The private certifiers inspected and certified or did not certify buildings for the people who paid them, the people who supplied their paychecks. This was supposed to be a prime example of privatization, setting the agenda and making everything cheaper and better quality. Sir George Chapman, first chairman of the Building Industry Authority, said, "The marketplace will be the judge." This was more or less the mantra of the times, as anyone old enough to remember those times will recall. I myself don't remember it from New Zealand because I was not here until 2004, but I remember clearly the very parallel course in the United States under Reaganomics. So the problem basically was insurance. Insurance was very reluctant to insure this kind of industry. It's amazing, this kind of endeavor, as you had the clear conflict of interest. It lasted 10 years, from 1995 to 2005, but it was already dying by early 2000s. And looking back, how could anyone have believed this would work? Another example of the perfect storm was the loss of a really important institution that for decades had played a vital role in ensuring that New Zealand buildings were built properly. This is the Clerks of Works. And the Clerks of Works, they have one goal: to make sure the building is built right. Sadly, in the NZ building industry ecosystem, Clerks of Works are a critically endangered species. Today, one of the most valuable, cost-effective links in the building and construction chain has nearly vanished. These highly skilled, experienced tradespeople fill the role that building inspectors and private certifiers could never fill. They check the work at all stages with constant or near constant on-site presence. Crucially, they bring to the building site authority and independence to ensure the build is finished according to specifications and according to code. This authority and independence was legislated in the Clerks of Works Act that enabled this institution in New Zealand. As I remember, it was from the 1940s. Clerks of Works focused strongly on the public interest as opposed to necessarily private building certifiers who focused on the interest of the people who employed them. This private interest focus was actually written into the legislation. In December 1992, Parliament passed the Clerks of Works Repeal Act. Anyone could now call themselves a Clerks of Works, a Clerk of Works. Another aspect which probably most people are familiar with is the limited liability corporate regime. From March 19, here's an example, one of the most egregious examples. From March 1987 to March 2002, 19 companies named Sigatoka Investments registered on the New Zealand Companies Office Register. They had the same name. 18 of them appeared in the 8 years between March 1994 and March 2002. All have come and gone. The risk these companies may have or may not have taken on was isolated in this process through ring fencing. The risk remains with the old company. The new company has none of the risk. Besides the corporate name, these companies shared a human name. Property developer Timothy Terrence Manning was a director and/or shareholder in each. A lecturer in commercial law at Victoria University told me, they keep doing it and doing it and doing it because in New Zealand they can. One of the most creative aspects of Timothy Terrence Manning was his setting up of a company, which is here in the graphic displayed, called Spare Company Number 2 Limited. This company was set up by Manning in 2009. Another aspect of the Leaky Building's perfect storm that was not helpful was confidentiality. Of course, when you're looking to solve a problem, information is everything. The less information you have, the less able you are to get to the root of the problem and actually figure out how to solve it. Unfortunately, territorial authorities were bound and still are by the secretive commercial template that forces them to conceal exactly how they spend our money. This is a result of the Local Government Official Information and Meetings Act of 1987, which brought the commercial template into the operation of territorial authorities. You had chief executives running the show instead of engineers. One builder, Thomas Witzler, talked about this and said, intellectual property is buried in confidentiality of settlements. Ian Holyoake was more blunt. Stuff the confidentiality provisions. We need solutions, not secrets. The public interest is surely far greater than the confidentiality requirement of single organizations. And obviously, confidentiality can even hide ongoing negotiations or a settlement. Ironically, this is enabled by the Local Government Official Information Act, which is subtitled An Act to Make Official Information Held by Local Authorities More Freely Available. In 1991, High Court Justice J. Jeffries wrote, there cannot be allowed to develop in this country a kind of commercial Alsatia beyond the reach of a statute. Confidentiality is not an absolute concept admitting of no exceptions. I looked up Alsatia. It turns out Alsatia was an area around Whitefriars, London in the 17th century, which was a sanctuary for criminals and debtors. A huge factor in the expenses and the damage which this disaster is known for and or related to is New Zealand's joint and several liability regime. As Melbourne solicitor Kim Lovegrove put it, by virtue of the fact that you have deep pockets, you will pay for the sins of your bedfellows. This means that the last man standing, i.e. the people who cannot go out of business, such as some of the corporations the person we were talking about did, you have to pay for the sins of the people who are out of business. In other words, the focus is on the right of the people who were injured. And the NZ Law Commission looked into this. They wrote, the experience of leaky homes leaves especially larger or highly exposed local authorities with no effective insurance options for any major public liability risks. They did recommend that this joint and several regime remain standing. However, they said, there can be no doubt that territorial authorities played a major role in the Leaky building disaster. Equally true, the joint and several regime has often forced them to pay beyond their responsibility. Time and again, theirs has been the deepest pockets. For a council, a quick trip to Oz has never been an option. So insurance is key. If we can reform the Building Act with regards to insurance, we may be able eventually to start thinking about reforming a joint and several liability. Yet another aspect of the Leaky buildings disaster was the repeal of the Building Performance Guarantee Act. This act lasted for only 10 years, but during those 10 years, the New Zealand government actually guaranteed new homes. It's through the Building Performance Guarantee Corporation. On 18 December 1987, the fourth Labor government wrecking ball demolished the BPGC via the Finance Act. This happened 3 months before the same-day abolition of the Ministry of Works and the Timber Preservation Authority. Though the BPGC covered only 25% of new houses, the New Zealand Institute of Architects believed the refusal of cover to careless builders, quote, led to a significant improvement in the quality of house construction until its abrupt abolition in 1988. It is now obvious that had it been reinstated as a compulsory scheme, as the Building Industry Commission advised in 1990, the leaky house crisis would never have developed with the speed or to the extent that it did. Local government amendment acts were heavily involved in this crisis as well. This refers to the privatization and the business model that I referred to earlier. One person in the industry who worked for Carter Holt Harvey, Guy Cavanaugh, told me an awful lot of building officials were got rid of at the time. And so through the early 1990s, there wasn't that sort of skill level. The focus became the annual balance sheets, short-term savings, rather than the long-term picture. This was, of course, the business model's focus. A prime example was an innovation local government borrowed from the private sector. Key performance indicators, in parentheses, KPIs. For councils, this could mean number of building consents issued per unit of time, as well as average time per inspection. Regarding KPIs, a major report in 2002, the HUN report, was frank. These are counterproductive incentives and promote totally wrong behavior and lead to adverse outcomes. This was the commercial approach, and it often generated a race to the bottom. This was exactly the opposite of the promises of the bold neoliberal vision behind these reforms. One of the aspects of this disaster is how much information we don't have. Now, there have been 2 reports which have, as I mentioned, which have estimated the number of leaky buildings or leaky homes, but these were only estimates, and a lot of this information has been missed by people who have never had a chance to report or have been unable to or unwilling to report this disaster happening to them personally. So I've got a picture of Rangitoto here because one of the people I talked to had a tremendous view. Her view wasn't of Rangitoto, but there are plenty of homes that had that view, I reckon, that did have weather tightness problems. That's because if they're exposed to the elements, which comes with the homes that have leaky building problem, then you've got increased danger of weather tightness failure. One of those reports, data on residential weather tightness failure, said, anecdotally, there is a considerable amount of remediation occurring at the sub-consent level, although its effectiveness is unknown. This is what everybody I talked to told me. There's so much that we don't know. For Josie, this was the person who had this house, that's not her name. Risk aversion in industry and government had combined to remove the option of legally sanctioned and relatively affordable targeted repair of weather tightness failure. She was told that the first class estimate to get her building fixed was $400,000. She simply couldn't afford that. And there are many, many people who have been in this situation and who still are. For more on targeted repair versus full reclad / re-roof, see an article I wrote called Something Rotten in the State. This is in the recent issue of Architecture New Zealand, the January-February 2021 issue. Almost everybody that I've talked to in the building industry who I've asked this question has told me without any equivocation that it's not over. We're still building leaky buildings. There are a few who believe we have solved it, but the vast majority are quite certain that we're still doing this. The bad news is, in February 2013, 2 of the 3 HUN report authors wrote to Prime Minister Bill English and said, now, 10 years on, in our view, little has been done to address the essential issues raised in our report or to action many of our recommendations. So, 27 years after leaky homes first made the news, we are still building them. How can this be? There is some good news. Some respected industry figures believe we have made real progress. A look at the current, this mid-2019 when I wrote the book, state of some of the major elements of the leaky building's perfect storm seems to bear this out. This approach is obviously unscientific. For now, we have nothing else. The leaky building's disaster is manifestly the single largest market failure in New Zealand history. This tragedy continues to flow from structural reforms opposed decades ago from the top down. Structural problems demand structural solutions. 40 years ago, building industry leaders organized to call for reform because buildings were too expensive. Today, New Zealand homes are far more expensive than they've ever been. Worse, many are both expensive and substandard. Their residents are the lucky ones. They have homes. During this time, as we know, homelessness has increased dramatically. Learning from history. In 1949, the Ministry of Works published New Zealand architect Cedric Firth's State Housing in New Zealand. This is a picture of the cover. He wrote, "Housing today is a major issue. Probably never before have so many houses been wanted so quickly." This does sound familiar. This report described in detail the enormous ongoing government response to the urgent need for healthy and durable housing. Government and industry worked together. Government purchased the land, planned the houses and the housing schemes, and supervised construction through the Ministry of Works, Department of Housing Construction. From 1946 to 1995, New Zealanders built 160,570 homes. Of these, 78% were private homes, while 22% were state houses. Thousands have lasted well for over half a century. In 2019, KiwiBuild aimed to produce 100,000 new affordable homes for first home buyers by 2028. As we know, this target has been scrapped. In public housing, the outlook is less dismal. Government is, quote, on track to deliver 18,000 extra places, homes and transitional housing by 2024. This time, though, there is no Ministry of Works. Government will rely entirely on private industry, as they have since 1988, for the engineering and for the build. One hopes for the best, of course, but this is not a structural solution. The foundation of unprecedented, monumental devastation in housing and in the building industry was the drive in the 1980s and 90s to remodel local and national government on commercial principles. A rethink of this revolution, i.e. a structural solution, seems long overdue. Emanuel Hegel wrote, what history teaches, George Hegel wrote, what history teaches us is this, that neither people nor governments have ever learned anything from history, nor acted on principles deduced from it. Was Hegel right? The sources of my quotes, data, and other information are given in footnotes to Rottenomics, the story of New Zealand's Leaky buildings disaster. For more information or to contact me, here's the Leaky Buildings website, https://leaky-buildings.peterdyer.nz/. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. We certainly appreciate your time.
Thank you.
And we only have one question that's come through so far. And in your opinion, what's the major failure to building construction that's occurred?
Of the building and construction?
Yeah. What's the primary failure?
The primary failure. I'm not sure there is a primary failure. That's the aggravating thing about this, and why it's been so tricky to address, to figure out, address, and to resolve. There's a number of failures, as I laid out in the perfect storm. I can say, though, that the failure that actually seems to have received the most public attention is of the Leaky buildings disaster is untreated timber. That's the scapegoat. That's the one that's gotten the most publicity, I believe. But I do believe that if you're going to single out a class of failures, then I would go farther back or further up the ladder and say a lot of these structural failures can fall into a system of a class of failures that resulted from the radical restructuring of New Zealand business and government that happened under Rottenomics, under the drive to remodel business and government, local and national government, on business principles. And I'd say that this is at the root of maybe even the majority of the failures behind the Leaky buildings disaster. So if there's a class, one single thing, then I'd say it's a class of failures. Now, there are other failures related to that and other failures that may not have anything to do with it, but that's the one that really stands out. The Rottenomics revolution and the effect it had on the building industry. That's my belief anyway. And I believe that evidence makes a strong case for this.
Thank you. The next one, and I'm not sure if this is a comment or a question, as it says, we're still building leaky buildings. Do architects not know how to detail a building to keep the water out?
Please, would you repeat that? I'm having trouble hearing.
Sure, it says we're still building leaky buildings. Do architects not know how to detail a building to keep the water out?
Well, I think if you ask an architect, they would probably say, yes, we do know how not to build leaky buildings. I don't know if you can blame any single class of person or cause for leaky buildings, as I've laid out. Certainly, before architects became aware of leaky building problems with some of these designs, I think that you can lay some of the blames at their feet. But as I mentioned, there were a host of other problems. Even when these monolithic design buildings with these beautiful finished faces and no eaves or overhangs and no drainage, looking back, you just wonder how they were ever approved, but it was the fashion at the time. And I don't know if maybe it's easy to blame architects retroactively, but there were a number of other failures involved too. Certainly in the way they were built, in the haste with which they were built, and in the building materials themselves, and the inspection and so forth. The perfect storm comes in again here. So yes, I believe that there were some architectural failures, but I don't believe that architects can by any means take the whole blame for the whole problem.
Right, and sorry, let me just get up to the top of the list. Which I seem to have, there we are, sorry. Now it says, this is possibly from an engineer. What can engineers bring to bear on this problem with regards to a code of ethics? That's, you can give that a nudge if you want to. From my point of view, then you have to make sure that you're working within your bounds of competence.
I'm listening, Martin.
Yeah, it's a very good question. Obviously, we need to be making sure that B2 is being complied with. The most useful way that you can do that is by, the easiest way to do that is by working within the standards. There's the durability guideline that you can download from inside the Engineering New Zealand members area. And there are, there's also the maintenance templates that you can be providing to building owners and so on as well. So there's a few things that you can be doing. I think that ethically, you know, if you see problems, then, and you know that they're going to be problems, then you need to be bringing those up with the architect at the time.
Yes, that's very good. I think education really is a key. If I were building a home myself, I'd want to know everything I could about what might happen, especially in light of history. So education, very important. And I do believe that I would have a responsibility to learn as much as I could, not just to leave it in the hands of people who have assured me that everything will be okay. This is one of the lessons, I think, lessons for everybody involved in every link in the building chain, from the consumer all the way up to local and national government, including the building industry.
Yeah, having said that, of course, we don't expect engineers to be experts in weather tightness. unless that's your particular area of expertise. Right, so the next one will be, do you think treated timber is actually needed? And this sort of relates back to the next question as well, so I'll ask two of them at the same time. Overseas jurisdictions with similar climates use untreated timber successfully. And the next question is similar, and it's, do other countries have the same problems with their timber framed houses, and what are their solutions?
Martin, I'm sorry, I'm having trouble hearing. I'm going to try to put my hearing aids in and see if that helps.
Sure.
Because just a minute, please.
How's that?
That's going to be better as long as they stay on the same setting. So
Great.
that's a lot better. Thanks.
So two connected questions around whether treated timber is required in buildings, and with other countries that do they have the same problems with the timber frame houses, and if so, what are their solutions?
Okay, well, I wouldn't rely on somebody who's just written a book about it. I would just ask the question about treated timber of somebody in the industry. On the other hand, there are, as far as I know, structural timber, which is likely to be in some way exposed or affected by the weather, certainly is treated as far as I understand. And I would advise asking those questions. If you are building a house, asking exactly that question of the people who are involved in the process, especially the architects and the builders, and research yourself. This one of the things that, unfortunately, one of the aspects of this whole lessons of this whole process is that you really consumers need to be more proactive than they've been, because there's a lot of them who just had blind trust in the whole process, in the industry and government, who were unfortunately proved that their trust was misplaced. Now, that's not to say that the majority of people in the industry and government can't be trusted. That's far from it. I want to make that clear. But there was enough bad apples and enough lax oversight and enough of that feeling that if that quasi-religious feeling that if you just leave it to the market, everything will be a better quality and cheaper. That kind of ran through the whole country, through the whole industry at the time, and through government as well. And I think now for some time, we've been reaping the fruits of that mistaken ideology.
Yeah, look, there's quite a few more questions,
Okay,
but we've pretty well run out of time there. And so what I'm going to do is I'll compile these afterwards, and I'll communicate with you, Peter, and see if we can answer the relevant questions and send them out with a copy of the webinar.
Okay, I apologize for my hearing. It's
no, that's no problem at all.
It's fine now, though.
And yeah, look, thank you very much. Certainly appreciate your time and your experience. And the book is fantastic. I've got a copy of it myself. If anybody wants more information, then I highly recommend buying it. You can buy it online, and I got mine from a local bookstore, so there's probably some in there as well.
Yes, thank you very much, Martin, for inviting me to do this. It's a real honor and a privilege.
No problem at all, and thank you for your time.
Thank you.